Each patrol taught me the same lesson the system refused to learn. The escorts moved before I did, as if my position was already known. What I recovered from the sea confirmed what my reports could not change. After that, silence felt heavier than depth. In early March 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had entered its longest and most demanding phase. German U-boat operations were stretched across vast ocean areas from the eastern seaboard of North America to the convoy routes approaching the British Isles. The operational command of the submarine force, the Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, BDU, continued to emphasize sustained pressure on Allied shipping as a means to cut Britain off from vital supplies. Monthly tonnage figures were still closely tracked, and success was measured in sinkings rather than survivability. At this point in the war, the German submarine fleet faced conditions markedly different from those of earlier years. Allied escort strength had steadily increased since 1941. New destroyers, corvettes, and escort carriers were now entering service in significant numbers. Radar, high-frequency direction finding, and improved sonar were being deployed more widely, even if their precise effectiveness was not fully understood by German crews. The Atlantic remained large, but it was no longer empty. One of the many commanders operating under these conditions was Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Vollmer, a career naval officer in his mid-30s. Vollmer commanded a Type 7C U-boat assigned to operations in the North Atlantic convoy lanes. His boat had been commissioned in late 1941 and had completed several patrols without notable distinction. The crew was experienced but not celebrated. Like many boats operating in 1943, it carried a mix of seasoned petty officers and younger sailors with limited sea time. Vollmer was not part of the inner circle of famous U-boat aces. His name did not appear frequently in official communiques or propaganda reports. He was regarded by superiors as competent, methodical, and cautious. His patrol reports were detailed and unemotional, focusing on weather conditions, mechanical issues, and contact observations rather than claims of success. This approach reflected his background. He had served on surface ships before transferring to submarines and retained a preference for structured procedures and written records. The patrol that would later define his career began from the French Atlantic coast, where U-boat pens offered protection from air attack but little comfort. Concrete walls shielded the boats, yet crews lived with constant noise, dampness, and restricted space. Supplies were loaded according to standard allocation: torpedoes, fuel, food, spare parts, and classified materials. Among the latter were recognition manuals, tactical summaries, and captured documents from earlier operations, all kept under strict control. Vollmer's orders were routine. He was assigned to a patrol line intended to intercept westbound convoys south of Iceland. Intelligence estimates suggested moderate escort strength, and BDU assessments still assumed that coordinated wolfpack attacks could overwhelm defenses if contact was maintained. The emphasis remained on endurance and persistence rather than innovation. In the first days at sea, the patrol unfolded without incident. Weather conditions were poor but manageable. Heavy seas limited surface speed and complicated lookout duties, but such conditions were familiar to the crew. Routine drills were conducted, including crash dives and torpedo readiness checks. Radio silence was maintained except for scheduled transmissions to BDU. Vollmer spent much of his time in the control room, reviewing charts and previous patrol logs. He had a habit of comparing expected convoy routes with actual sightings reported by other boats. This habit, while not unusual, was increasingly frustrating. Many contacts reported by U-boats failed to result in successful attacks. Escorts appeared more quickly than anticipated, and convoys altered course with greater frequency. On the seventh day of the patrol, the boat detected distant propeller noises while submerged. Hydrophone operators reported multiple screws, suggesting a convoy. Vollmer brought the boat to periscope depth but found visibility limited by sea state and low cloud cover. Brief glimpses of mastheads confirmed the presence of merchant vessels, but escort positions were difficult to determine. The attack did not proceed. Before firing parameters could be established, sonar pings were detected. Escorts had already identified the U-boat's general location. Vollmer ordered a silent dive to greater depth. Over the next several hours, the boat endured intermittent depth charge attacks. None caused serious damage, but the crew noted the precision of the escort pattern. Charges detonated closer than those experienced on earlier patrols. When the pursuit finally ended, Volmer recorded the incident in the war diary with restrained language. He noted that the escorts appeared to coordinate their movements effectively, and the attack developed rapidly despite poor weather. There was no mention of surprise or speculation. Instead, he marked the encounter as increasingly typical. Similar incidents followed. Contacts were fleeting. Escorts reacted quickly. Opportunities to approach convoys undetected were rare. The boat's torpedo inventory remained largely untouched, not from restraint, but from lack of viable firing solutions. As the patrol progressed, mechanical strain became evident. Extended submerged operations reduced battery efficiency, and frequent changes in depth placed stress on hull fittings. None of these issues were unusual, but together they contributed to a growing sense of operational limitation. The crew spent more time evading than attacking. One incident stood out for its administrative rather than tactical significance. While surfacing at night to recharge batteries, the boat encountered debris floating in the water. Wooden fragments, oil slicks, and paper material. Such debris was often associated with recently attacked convoys. Volmer ordered a cautious approach. No escorts were visible, and radar warning devices did not indicate immediate danger. Among the floating material were several waterlogged documents contained in a partially intact satchel. Recovering items from the sea was not uncommon. Survivors, wreckage, and cargo were frequently encountered. Most documents were destroyed to prevent intelligence compromise. In this case, however, the satchel appeared to contain printed material rather than personal effects. The items were brought aboard and examined briefly. The papers were in English and heavily soaked, but some diagrams and tables were still legible. Volmer did not immediately recognize their significance. Following standard procedure, he ordered them dried and secured for later inspection. They were placed in a sealed container, logged, and stored with other recovered materials. The patrol continued without further notable engagements. Fuel consumption and battery wear limited operational options. After several weeks at sea, BDU ordered the boat to return to base. Loss rates among U-boats had increased during this period, and operational areas were being adjusted frequently. The return transit was conducted with caution. Air patrol sightings forced multiple dives, and radio traffic suggested heightened Allied activity near the Bay of Biscay. When the boat finally entered port, it did so without damage, but also without confirmed successes. During post-patrol procedures, Volmer began the routine process of compiling his report. It was during this administrative phase that he returned to the recovered documents. Once partially dried, their contents became clearer. They appeared to be excerpts from an Allied naval manual, including sections on convoy defense procedures and escort coordination. Such documents were typically forwarded to intelligence specialists without detailed review by commanding officers. Volmer, however, took time to examine them himself. His familiarity with convoy encounters made the diagrams immediately relevant. He noted discrepancies between German expectations and operational reality, but these were framed as tactical challenges rather than strategic failures. The documents were prepared for transfer to naval intelligence, and Volmer completed his report. His final remarks emphasized increasing escort effectiveness and reduced attack opportunities. The language was measured, consistent with previous patrols, and contained no explicit criticism of doctrine. The patrol ended as many others did in 1943, without decisive engagement, without recognition, and without immediate consequence. Yet the materials recovered at sea and the patterns Volmer had quietly recorded would remain with him beyond the formal debriefing.
By late March 1943, the broader operational picture confronting the German submarine arm was becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile with official expectations. Loss reports circulated quietly through the pens along the French coast. Boats failed to return. Patrol durations shortened. Survivors spoke less of attacks and more of evasion. BDU directives, however, continued to emphasize aggressive interception and the maintenance of pressure on Allied shipping routes. Following his return to base, Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Vollmer underwent the standard cycle of debriefing, equipment inspection, and crew rotation. Intelligence officers collected patrol logs and any recovered material, including the English language documents retrieved from the sea. These were catalogued and forwarded for analysis. Vollmer was not informed of their destination or assessment, nor did he expect to be. What remained with him were the impressions formed during the patrol itself. As routine maintenance was carried out on his boat, Vollmer reviewed earlier war diaries, including those from 1941 and early 1942. The contrast was apparent. Earlier patrols described extended surface operations, deliberate approaches, and relatively slow escort responses. More recent entries were dominated by sonar contacts, radar warnings, and defensive maneuvers. The shift was not dramatic in any single engagement, but cumulative. Escorts now appeared in coordinated groups rather than as isolated threats. Air patrols overlapped convoy routes with increasing regularity. Even in poor weather, detection seemed faster and more consistent. Vollmer noted the time between initial contact and counteraction had shortened. His next assignment came quickly. Despite mounting losses, operational tempo remained high. Vollmer's boat was scheduled for another Atlantic patrol, this time farther west, where BDU assessments suggested Allied coverage might still be incomplete. The crew was partially rotated. Replacements included younger sailors with limited patrol experience. Training emphasized alertness and damage control rather than attack procedures. Before departure, Vollmer received updated operational guidance. The instructions reiterated existing doctrine: maintain contact with convoys, signal BDU promptly, and coordinate attacks with other boats when possible. There was no mention of changes to escort tactics or detection technology beyond general warnings to exercise caution. The boat departed under overcast skies, passing through familiar channels before entering open water. Within days, radio traffic indicated heavy Allied convoy movement. Vollmer plotted expected routes and positioned the boat accordingly. As before, weather conditions were unfavorable, with heavy seas limiting surface operations. Initial contacts followed a familiar pattern. Hydrophone detections suggested distant traffic, but attempts to close were frequently disrupted by escort maneuvers. On one occasion, the boat approached to within estimated firing range before being forced down by radar-directed escorts. Depth charges followed quickly, delivered in patterns that suggested advanced planning rather than reaction. The crew's responses were efficient but strained. Battery levels declined with repeated dives. Ventilation became an issue. The psychological pressure of prolonged evasion was evident, particularly among newer sailors. Vollmer maintained discipline through routine and procedure, avoiding speculation or commentary. Over the course of the patrol, Vollmer observed that escorts no longer relied solely on visual detection. Approaches conducted at night or in poor visibility were often countered as effectively as daytime attempts. Radar warning receivers provided some notice, but responses were often too late to disengage fully. In his diary, Vollmer began noting specific patterns. Escorts approached from angles that suggested foreknowledge of the boat's position rather than chance discovery. Changes in convoy course appeared coordinated and deliberate, reducing interception opportunities. The boat's presence, even when submerged and silent, seemed anticipated. Another encounter reinforced these observations. After briefly sighting a convoy through the periscope, Vollmer attempted a submerged approach using hydrophone bearings alone. Before a firing solution could be established, multiple escorts converged. Sonar contact was immediate and sustained. The ensuing depth charge attack lasted several hours. Damage was minimal, but the psychological effect was significant. The crew recognized that detection occurred without visual confirmation. The attack pattern suggested continuous tracking rather than intermittent contact.
When the escorts finally withdrew, Vollmer recorded the event with unusual detail, including estimated distances and timing. As the patrol continued, opportunities diminished further. Several days passed without any viable contacts. Fuel consumption and battery wear again became limiting factors. BDU transmissions urged persistence but offered little practical guidance beyond encouragement. During a scheduled radio transmission window, Vollmer received reports of multiple U-boat losses in adjacent patrol areas. No details were provided, but the frequency of such messages had increased noticeably since the beginning of the year. The operational map, he maintained, grew increasingly sparse. Vollmer's attention returned repeatedly to the recovered Allied documents from his previous patrol. Though he had not retained copies, their content lingered in memory. Diagrams showing escort screen arrangements, descriptions of coordinated responses, and references to combined air and surface operations aligned closely with his recent experiences. He began to suspect that Allied procedures had reached a level of standardization and dissemination that German intelligence had underestimated. These were not isolated innovations, but systemic changes. Escorts behaved as if following established doctrine rather than improvising. The realization did not lead to immediate action. Vollmer remained bound by orders and expectations. His role was to execute assigned missions, not to reassess strategy. Nevertheless, his reports grew more precise. He avoided attributing failures to chance or weather, instead focusing on observable patterns. Toward the end of the patrol, the boat encountered debris similar to that seen previously, though no documents were recovered. The presence of wreckage without survivors suggested rapid convoy engagements and efficient escort response. Vollmer noted the absence of prolonged rescue activity, indicating confidence in area security. When the patrol concluded, the boat returned once again without confirmed sinkings. The atmosphere in port was subdued. Loss boards displayed new entries. Maintenance crews worked continuously to prepare boats for redeployment, often with reduced turnaround times. During debriefing, Vollmer presented his observations calmly. Intelligence officers acknowledged his reports, but offered no indication of broader conclusions. Official assessments continued to emphasize the need for perseverance and the eventual wearing down of Allied resources. Privately, Vollmer reviewed his accumulated patrol data. The trend was clear to him, though not yet articulated formally. The operational environment had shifted decisively. Detection preceded attack. Evasion dominated action. The assumptions underpinning earlier success no longer held. He did not yet frame these observations as evidence of inevitable defeat. Instead, he regarded them as indicators of a widening gap between doctrine and reality. The Atlantic, once characterized by uncertainty and opportunity, now appeared structured and defended. As preparations began for yet another patrol, Vollmer faced the practical consequences of these conditions. The risks were increasing and the margin for error narrowing. The documents recovered earlier, though officially beyond his reach, had provided a framework for understanding what he now encountered repeatedly at sea. The problem was no longer a single convoy or a single patrol. It was systemic, embedded in procedures and technology that the German submarine force had not fully accounted for. Vollmer continued his work with professionalism, but with a growing awareness that the environment he operated in had fundamentally changed.
By April 1943, the cumulative effect of repeated patrols under increasingly hostile conditions began to shape Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Vollmer's judgment in ways that extended beyond routine observation. The operational rhythm of the U-boat force remained outwardly unchanged, but the underlying assumptions guiding its deployment were under growing strain. Vollmer, like many commanders of his generation, operated within a system that rewarded persistence and obedience rather than reinterpretation. His third patrol of the year commenced under conditions that were officially described as challenging but manageable. BDU reassigned several boats, including Fulmer's, to form a patrol line south of Greenland, where convoy density remained high. Intelligence summaries suggested that Allied escort coverage thinned at extreme ranges. The assessment was not without basis, but it underestimated how far Allied coordination had already extended. The departure was efficient and unremarkable. Supplies were loaded with increased emphasis on spare parts and medical stores, a subtle indication of anticipated stress. Torpedo allocation remained unchanged, reflecting continued confidence in offensive potential. Fulmer reviewed his orders carefully, noting that they mirrored earlier directives almost exactly. Within days of entering the patrol area, the limitations of those directives became apparent. Contact reports from other boats were brief and often ended abruptly, followed by silence. Radio traffic was heavy, but actionable intelligence was sparse. The ocean remained vast, yet the movement of convoys appeared increasingly predictable to Allied forces rather than to the U-boats attempting interception. Fulmer's boat detected a convoy on hydrophones during daylight hours. The bearing was steady, and speed estimates suggested a westbound group of moderate size. Fulmer ordered a submerged approach, intending to surface under cover of darkness. The maneuver was executed precisely, but before nightfall, sonar contact was established by escorts. The response was immediate. Multiple escorts converged with a level of coordination Fulmer had not observed earlier in the war. Sonar pings were continuous, and depth charges were deployed in patterns that forced the boat to alter course repeatedly. The attack persisted for hours, with minimal interruption. During this engagement, Fulmer made a decision that deviated subtly from established practice. Rather than attempting to maintain proximity to the convoy in hopes of re-establishing contact, he ordered a deeper withdrawal once battery levels reached a critical threshold. The decision reduced immediate risk, but effectively ended any chance of attack. This choice was not explicitly prohibited, but it ran counter to the emphasis on sustained contact stressed by BDU. Fulmer justified it internally on practical grounds. Remaining in the area would likely lead to detection without offensive opportunity. Withdrawal preserved the boat and crew for future operations, though it also meant reporting another unsuccessful engagement. As the patrol continued, similar decisions followed. Fulmer avoided prolonged shadowing when detection risk was high. He prioritized evasion over pursuit, particularly in areas where air coverage was suspected. These choices reduced exposure, but further limited chances of success. The cumulative effect was a patrol defined almost entirely by defensive action. No torpedoes were fired, no surface approaches were attempted. The crew's workload remained heavy, but its focus had shifted from attack execution to damage avoidance. Morale remained stable, but expectations were muted. It was during this patrol that Fulmer encountered another opportunity to examine Allied procedures more closely. After a night surfaced to recharge batteries, the boat detected distant radio transmissions on Allied frequencies. Though encrypted, the volume and regularity suggested coordinated activity across multiple units. Fulmer noted the timing relative to convoy movements and escort responses. These observations reinforced impressions formed earlier. Allied forces appeared to operate from a shared operational framework, with standardized responses to contact and loss of contact. The behavior was consistent across regions, suggesting centralized training and doctrine rather than ad hoc adaptation. Fulmer began to reconsider the significance of the recovered manual from his earlier patrol. At the time, it had seemed merely informative. Now it appeared representative of a broader system that German intelligence had not fully penetrated. The manual had not introduced novel technology, it had codified procedures. That codification, Fulmer realized, was itself decisive.
This realization did not come as a dramatic revelation. It developed gradually, shaped by repeated encounters and careful comparison. Fulmer did not conclude that individual U-boats were outmatched by superior equipment alone. Instead, he perceived that the Allies had achieved integration between air and sea units, between detection and response, and between doctrine and execution. Late in the patrol, Fulmer recorded a summary observation in his diary. He noted that escort reactions appeared preemptive rather than reactive, and that convoy defense operated as a continuous system rather than a series of isolated measures. The language was cautious, but the implication was clear. The patrol ended without incident, and the boat returned to base with fuel reserves lower than anticipated due to extended submerged operations. Loss reports received during the return transit confirmed the disappearance of several boats assigned to nearby sectors. The operational map grew thinner still. During debriefing, Fulmer submitted his report without embellishment. He described his decisions and observations in technical terms, avoiding conclusions that might be interpreted as criticism of command. Intelligence officers asked routine questions and acknowledged receipt of his materials. Privately, Fulmer continued to reflect on the pattern he had observed. The turning point for him was not a single engagement or loss, but the recognition that Allied success rested on organization rather than improvisation. The system confronting him was resilient, adaptive, and increasingly comprehensive. This understanding placed Fulmer in a difficult position. As a commanding officer, he was responsible for executing orders within existing doctrine, yet his experience suggested that the doctrine itself no longer matched operational reality. The choices he had begun to make, prioritizing survival and selective disengagement, were practical but unsanctioned. The risk was no longer abstract. Each patrol increased the likelihood that deviation from expectations would be scrutinized. At the same time, strict adherence offered diminishing returns and rising danger. Fulmer recognized that the margin for individual judgment was narrowing. As preparations began for the next patrol, Fulmer faced the implications of his evolving assessment. The Atlantic he operated in was not the Atlantic described in training manuals or early war reports. It was an environment shaped by Allied coordination and foresight.
The realization did not prompt open defiance or immediate action. It remained internal, shaping decisions quietly. Yet it marked a decisive shift in how Fulmer understood his role and the conflict he was part of. By May 1943, the divergence between official expectations and operational reality had become difficult to ignore within the German submarine force, even if it was rarely addressed openly. Losses increased sharply during this period, particularly in the North Atlantic. Boats failed to return at a rate that strained both morale and logistics. Replacement crews arrived faster than experienced ones could be trained. Patrol areas were adjusted repeatedly, often in response to events already concluded. Captain Lieutenant Heinrich Fulmer entered this phase of the campaign with a growing sense of constraint. His previous patrols had demonstrated the limits of aggressive pursuit under prevailing conditions, yet the directives he received showed little acknowledgement of those limits. Orders emphasized renewed offensives, closer patrol lines, and sustained contact regardless of risk. The next patrol assigned to Fulmer reflected this approach. His boat was ordered into an area west of the British Isles, where convoy density was high and air coverage increasingly overlapped with surface escorts. The rationale was straightforward. Concentration increased opportunity. The risk was understood, but not framed as prohibitive. Before departure, Fulmer attended a briefing led by senior officers. Losses were acknowledged but attributed to temporary fluctuations and intensified enemy effort. Confidence was expressed that continued pressure would force the Allies to overextend their resources. Tactical adjustments were mentioned, but doctrine remained intact. Fulmer did not challenge these assessments. His position did not afford him that role.
Instead, he reviewed his own data once more. He compared patrol tracks, contact timings, and escort responses across months. The pattern remained consistent. Detection preceded engagement. Escorts acted with coordination that suggested centralized planning rather than individual initiative. The patrol began under clear skies and unfavorable condition for U-boats. Air patrols were immediately apparent, forcing frequent dives. Battery management became critical from the outset. Fulmer limited submerged speed to conserve power, accepting reduced maneuverability as a trade-off. Early in the patrol, the boat encountered a westbound convoy under heavy escort. Fulmer attempted a distant shadowing maneuver, maintaining separation to avoid immediate detection. For several hours, the approach appeared successful. Hydrophone bearings remained steady, and no radar warnings were received. The situation changed abruptly. Without warning, sonar contact was established by an escort that approached from an unexpected direction. The response was rapid and coordinated. Additional escorts converged, and depth charges followed within minutes. The pattern suggested that the boat's presence had been anticipated rather than discovered. The ensuing evasion lasted through the night. Depth charges detonated with increasing accuracy, forcing the boat deeper and reducing available maneuvering space. Hull stress was noted, and several minor systems failed temporarily. The crew responded with discipline, but the strain was evident. At a critical point, Fulmer faced a choice similar to those he had made on earlier patrols, but with greater consequence. Remaining in the area risked continued detection and possible destruction. Withdrawal meant abandoning the assigned patrol sector without achieving contact or signaling BDU. Fulmer ordered a full disengagement. He altered course sharply, reduced speed, and descended to greater depth than previously attempted. The maneuver increased structural stress, but succeeded in breaking contact after several hours. When the boat eventually surfaced to recharge batteries, it did so far from the convoy route. The decision was recorded carefully in the war diary. Fulmer justified it on technical grounds, citing battery limitations, sustained sonar contact, and escalating escort coordination. The language was precise, but the implication was unavoidable. The patrol area was no longer tenable under current conditions. As the patrol continued, similar situations arose. Fulmer avoided areas with confirmed air coverage and refrained from signaling BDU unless contact was secure. These choices reduced exposure, but also reduced operational contribution. Radio silence was maintained beyond standard intervals, further isolating the boat. During the return transit, Fulmer received a radio message instructing him to explain the lack of engagement during the patrol. The tone was formal but pointed. He responded with a summary of conditions and encounters, emphasizing escort density and detection speed. The exchange remained within protocol, but it marked a departure from earlier, more routine communications. Upon return to base, the atmosphere was markedly different from previous visits. Loss boards were crowded, familiar boat numbers were crossed out. Maintenance crews worked continuously, often preparing boats with minimal rest for crews. The pace conveyed urgency rather than confidence. During debriefing, Fulmer was questioned more closely than before. Intelligence officers focused on his decision to disengage and his assessment of patrol viability. He reiterated his observations without assigning blame. He did not reference the recovered Allied manual directly, as its analysis lay outside his purview. The response was restrained. His report was accepted, but no indication was given that his conclusions would influence operational planning. BDU communications continued to stress perseverance and adjustment rather than withdrawal or doctrinal change. Privately, Fulmer recognized the narrowing space for individual judgment. Decisions that prioritized survival over engagement risked scrutiny, yet adherence to directives under prevailing conditions carried its own danger. The system offered limited room for reconciliation between these pressures.
As preparations for future operations were discussed, Fulmer faced the personal implications of his position. His experience suggested that the Atlantic had become a controlled environment, dominated by Allied coordination. The operational framework he operated under had not adapted at the same pace. The stakes were now immediate. Each patrol carried a higher probability of loss. The margin for error was minimal. Fulmer continued to fulfill his duties with professionalism, but the tension between reality and authority had reached its peak. The manual, recovered months earlier, though never mentioned again, had provided an early indication of this shift. What had once seemed incremental now appeared structural. The realization had not altered orders, but it had altered Fulmer's understanding of the conflict he was engaged in.
By the summer of 1943, the German submarine campaign in the Atlantic had entered a period of contraction. Operational losses forced a gradual reduction in patrol areas, and the tempo of deployments slowed, despite continued emphasis on resistance. Within the command structure, adjustments were discussed, but these rarely translated into immediate or visible changes for individual boats. Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Vollmer did not participate in strategic planning. His role remained operational and limited in scope. Following his most recent patrol, he was temporarily reassigned to shore duties while his boat underwent extended maintenance. Such assignments were common after periods of sustained operations and were often framed as routine rather than corrective. During this interval, Fulmer attended briefings and reviewed incoming patrol reports. The pattern he had observed firsthand was reflected increasingly in official summaries. Escort density was acknowledged as higher. Air coverage was recognized as more persistent. References to Allied coordination appeared more frequently, though still without explicit concession of strategic disadvantage. It was during this period that Fulmer learned, indirectly, of the fate of the recovered Allied manual. Intelligence assessments had confirmed its authenticity and relevance. The material was circulated among analytical sections, contributing to a growing body of evidence regarding Allied convoy defense doctrine. Fulmer was not credited formally, nor did he expect to be. The recovery was recorded as a minor intelligence gain among many. What mattered more to him was the confirmation of his earlier impressions. The manual had not revealed a single decisive innovation. Instead, it documented a system of layered defense built on communication, training, and standardization. This understanding aligned with what patrol commanders had been encountering for months. As losses mounted, BDU issued revised operational guidance. Greater emphasis was placed on survival and selective engagement. Patrol areas were adjusted, and some boats were withdrawn from the most heavily defended routes. These changes came incrementally and without public acknowledgement of failure, but they marked a departure from earlier insistence on sustained pressure. Fulmer's subsequent assignment reflected this shift. He was tasked with training duties, sharing operational experience with newer crews. His instruction focused on detection avoidance, battery management, and disengagement techniques. He did not frame these lessons as strategic commentary. They were presented as practical responses to observed conditions. In these sessions, Fulmer spoke calmly and without emphasis. He avoided speculation about outcomes and refrained from criticism of command. His credibility derived from experience rather than rank. Younger officers listened, aware of the losses suffered by those who had returned. Fulmer did not command another Atlantic patrol that year. Whether this was due to operational necessity, personnel management, or quiet acknowledgement of his assessments was not made explicit. He remained in service, fulfilling assigned roles as the focus of submarine operations shifted increasingly towards defensive and training functions. In the broader context, the Battle of the Atlantic continued, but its character had changed. Allied shipping losses declined. Escort effectiveness improved further. The German submarine force adapted unevenly, constrained by resources and institutional momentum. Fulmer's personal legacy was modest. He did not publish memoirs or receive public recognition. His contributions were embedded in reports, training notes, and the quiet transmission of experience. The manual he recovered became one of many documents that collectively informed German understanding of Allied capabilities, though not in time to reverse their impact. After the war, records of individual patrol commanders like Fulmer remained largely confined to archives. Their experiences illustrated the limits of doctrine when confronted with organized, adaptive opposition. The realization that emerged gradually among such officers was not one of sudden defeat, but of structural imbalance. The Atlantic had not been lost in a single engagement or through one technological advance. It was shaped by cumulative decisions, procedures, and coordination. Fulmer's encounter with an Allied manual had offered a glimpse into that system at an early stage. His subsequent patrols confirmed its effectiveness. His story does not center on heroism or failure in isolation. It reflects the experience of professionals operating within constraints, observing change, and adjusting quietly where possible. In that sense, his contribution lies in what he recognized and how he responded, rather than in what he achieved. If you value careful, historically grounded accounts of overlooked individuals and the systems they confronted, consider subscribing for more documented stories from the Second World War.